Good evening. My name is Allan Freyer. I'm on the board of the Cape Fear Economic Development Council. I was chosen to introduce the topic tonight because I am a CPA. I did not push this topic out of my personal interest, but I am really interested to hear what information we get out of this. I thank you for coming out. If you signed up on the list coming in, you will get email notifications of our upcoming events. We don't have a topic selected for our next event that we're publicizing yet, but check out our website. Our email list will let you know. Cape Fear Economic Development Council, we've been around a couple of years and basically believe that quality of place is the linchpin of this region and will lead to its future success. So that's really a key issue for us, and so we're out there to promote discussion of ideas and other things that are going to basically improve the quality of place and improve life here in Wilmington. And we thought this tax law changes or potential tax law changes definitely could have an impact on our way of life here in North Carolina. So I just wanted to introduce Allan Freyer. He is with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. He's come down to visit us from the Triangle area, and we appreciate your time this evening. We'll get going with his presentation. I think we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So thank you, Allan.
It's great to be with you all and bring you greetings from Raleigh. It's probably better that you're here in Wilmington with everything that's happening in Los Angeles. I wouldn't want to be in Raleigh either right now. So grateful for the opportunity to be here. My name is Allan Freyer. I'm a policy analyst with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. We're a part of the broader North Carolina Justice Center, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of low and middle income folks and to make sure that we have broadly shared prosperity in the state. I'm here with my colleague, Amber Rudy Dyer, and our director, Alexander Sirota, sends her regrets. She had a family medical emergency. She was hoping to be here really to talk with y'all about how best to collaborate together on the issues that we both care about. So sorry she's not here. She was actually going to give part of the presentation, so for things I don't know, she was going to make up for that. But we are, I'm going to talk probably till about maybe 5 till 7, and then open it up for questions. So if you can, unless there's some burning question you have to know right away, I said something that wasn't clear. If you can hold your questions till the end, we'll go through straight, one question after another. And then we are hoping to have Alexander Skype in to talk about organizing together at around 7:15, 7:15. So it's great to be here with you all. We are presenting, obviously, on tax reform, as was said, but the Budget and Tax Center works on a whole range of different fiscal and economic issues that are important to working families in North Carolina. So I'm excited to be here. I've been working with Lloyd for a long time on how to make something like this happen. So I'm just grateful that y'all invited me and had us come talk to you. So hopefully this will be the beginning of a fruitful conversation. And I'm going to try to get out from behind the podium and move around a little bit. I don't know. I'm slightly clumsy, so I'm afraid I'm trip over the wires. Would not be good. And so if the PowerPoint becomes a distraction because of the issue, the sort of resolution issues, let me know. I can try to sort of. Okay. I'll move down what Lloyd just mentioned. So we're going to talk a little bit about North Carolina's current tax system and some of the current proposals that are on the table that are both aspirational and real. And the aspirational ones are a bit scarier than the real ones. And then we'll talk about how this current tax proposals affect the fiscal condition of the state, and then look at how we expect them to impact the state's economy. And then lastly, we'll come and sort of have a conversation about how to organize together and find areas of collaboration. Well, you actually don't need the next slide. So state taxes matter for the state, right? Taxes provide the revenue that help fund critical public investments that matter for our quality of life, right? They fund our roads, they fund our schools that educate our kids, they train our workforce so that companies actually do want to locate in North Carolina. They provide parks, they provide a whole array of services that really make a difference for our quality of life in North Carolina. And so when we start with taxes, it is important to start with the fact that revenue matters for all of us. They matter for public investments, for the common good. So we have, there are really three core principles for what we think our tax code should look like. The first is really simple, right? The first job of taxation is to provide adequate revenue to meet the needs of state government, to provide core public services and public investments that matter for the economy. The second core principle that we care about is equity or fairness. There are a number of different definitions, right? The definition that we prefer is that lower income households aren't asked to carry the burden for paying taxes and financing state government. There are those in Raleigh, however, who define fairness in a completely different way. They define it as everyone should pay something. They forget, or pretend to forget, that everybody already is paying something, whether it's a sales tax or a gas tax or income tax. But you're going to hear both definitions of fairness. But we're going to talk specifically, most importantly, about the equity aspects of fairness. Make sure that low-income folks don't end up having to carry a disproportionate load of paying state taxes. And lastly, you hear this one a lot from Raleigh, and it's the importance of stability for ensuring that the state's tax system is able to provide a stable source of revenue, that it doesn't fluctuate wildly from year to year based on economic conditions. We have seen in the past that different aspects of the tax code lend itself more to stability than others. There's a lot of discussion in Raleigh right now that the personal income tax is bad, it's not stable, it fluctuates too wildly based on whether or not there's a recession. And that instead we need to move to sales taxes because they argue that sales taxes are more stable in downtimes. Again, they seem to forget that consumer spending drops in recessionary periods as well, almost actually to the same degree that income goes down as it relates to the personal income tax. So this chart is actually very important. This lays out currently the sources of our state's revenue base right now. You see the overwhelming largest share comes from the individual or personal income tax, 53% of the state revenue. This is 32%, it's cut off. This is the sales tax. So these are obviously the taxes that are levied at the point of sale for most goods that you purchase. And then 6% is the corporate income tax. Now, this pie chart is very different than it would have been about 80 years ago. It was mostly corporate income tax, shared evenly between sales and the personal income tax. Now, we hear a lot about tax reform when we talk about this chart of sources of the state's revenue. We hear a lot about tax reform because we hear that the state's tax code is obsolete, it's out of date, it's antiquated, right? And to some degree that is true. The current tax system taxes only a very narrow range of economic activity that occurs in the state of North Carolina. And in order to ensure adequacy, which we mentioned before, you want to make sure that you're able to tax as broad a portion of economic activity as possible so that you don't force individual portions of the state's economy to bear disproportionate loads. So the tax code was designed in 1932. It was updated again in 1935, back when North Carolina was a manufacturing hub. So this tax code currently basically leaves out 80% of the state's economy today, which is service provision. So the example we use is that your haircut isn't taxed under the current model, but the scissors that the barber buys are taxed at the point of sale. So in order to make sure that we do have an adequate system and that's fair and that's stable, we need to expand the base of the sales tax to include a whole variety of services. I think there were 132 services, 123 services that are currently untaxed in the state that need to be added. The big question with tax reform is not just that it's necessary, but it's how we do tax reform. And that is the big question. In Raleigh right now, they're saying that to do tax reform, we really need to cut taxes. We need to make sure, particularly, that the personal income tax and the corporate income tax go away. When you look at those two, that's 60% of the state budget. It's kind of hard to replace 60% of your revenue base if you're talking about eliminating. So I want you to stick with that image of the sort of 2/3 of the budget coming from those sources. Sorry, the podium is So I told you that services aren't taxed under current law. We need to change that to make it more stable and more fair. But when we talk about fairness and equity, we also need to talk about about who pays in our current model. You hear a lot in Raleigh about how you need to make sure that everyone has skin in the game. It's really unfortunate this chart is as cut off as it is. What you would see on this axis, on the, what's that, the right, your left axis, is the percent of income that goes to, that an individual pays in taxes, right? And what you see is that the lowest 20%, the poorest 20% of citizens in the state pay a larger share of their income in taxes than the wealthiest 1% do. So when you talk about skin in the game, poor folks already have more skin in the game than the folks at the top do. And this is the current system. And this is, we believe that this is an aspect of the tax code that desperately needs reform. We need to make sure that the bottom folks, the folks at the bottom of the income scale are not carrying the bulk of the tax load. It's also worth noting, I guess you can see it, you can see how the lowest 20%, the majority of their taxes are sales taxes. Whereas the top 1%, they're not paying very much sales tax relative to the size of their income because they end up saving so much of it. Instead, they pay most of their taxes in income tax, personal income tax usually. So imagine if we, just as a thought experiment, took this away. Not only are you taking away 60% of the state's revenue base, you're asking the top 1% to pay about 1% of their income taxes. Whereas you're still asking the poorest folks in the state to pay almost 6% of their income in taxes. So moving to a system where you eliminate the personal income tax is moving to a system in which low-income folks have to carry an even bigger share of the tax load than they currently do. So what about the spending side? When we talk about adequacy, we have to talk about spending, right? We need to make sure that the needs of our tax system are properly aligned with the needs of our state's public investments. So adequacy is really important. We need to make sure that we're able to finance our state obligations. Well, spending is actually at historic lows. We haven't spent this little as a share of our economy since 1974. So when folks in Raleigh are talking about adequacy, they're talking about making sure we can sort of hit these levels that are similar to what we've done since 2011 after all the big budget cuts since the recession. But the historic average for what adequacy means is that line, that top line right here, which is the 40-year average. So already we're talking about how different ideas of what adequacy looks like. That the current orange bar where we are now is, we don't believe, adequate to meet the needs of a 21st century economy. It's also worth pointing out that this chart is actually one of my favorite, and it does work this. So that little bottom chart, the little bottom graph, the bar there that's circled, the total general fund budget is actually, it's 11% less than it was 4 years ago. So you hear about this huge explosion of spending in Raleigh. It never happened, right? We're down 11% from where we were 4 years ago. So again, we had this different idea of what adequacy looks like. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. And I think that's in the packets that were passed out. If you care about the role of public education and community colleges in preparing the workforce of the future, they're down almost 12% and almost 5% respectively. So this represents significant disinvestment in the types of public structures that actually promote economic growth. Oh, this doesn't show up well. So this chart actually helps address the idea that adequacy for rural North Carolina is different than what adequacy looks like for urban areas in North Carolina. Urban areas have experienced the lion's share of job growth since the end of the recession. 90% of the jobs created in North Carolina are actually just created in 3 metros, in Durham, in Raleigh, and in Charlotte. And I know Wilmington's been hurting on the unemployment front. And so the idea that rural North Carolina is doing okay and can handle this investment in these core public investments is definitely something that we need to be able to address and say this is not true. Because at the end of the day, we need to ensure that revenue is adequate in order to support public investments that help rural North Carolina instead of promote disinvestment. So where does all the spending go? You hear a lot about it, right? Why do we need it to be adequate? These are this pie chart is really the context of tax reform. You know, spending's already at a 40-year low. Rural communities are disproportionately affected by disinvestment. And we have disinvestment in the core priorities of education that we looked at before. So in other words, we start tax reform when we're already in a revenue hole, we're already in a spending hole. And if we reduce revenues and cut taxes even further, then these are the areas that you would see even greater reduction. And you can see how education is the largest share of the budget. So if we're going to, say, eliminate 60% of our state's revenue, which is on the table as a discussion, where's most of it going to come from? Most of it's going to come from K through 12 education. There's just not. That's the biggest piece of the budget that would have to bear the biggest share of the impact. So, okay. So now we're talking about tax reform, which is probably why you guys came. So there are, through media accounts, through public statements, through draft legislation that's being circulated in the General Assembly, through actual legislation that's finally been introduced, we finally have a pretty good handle on the types of plans that are being meaningfully discussed in Raleigh as a meaningful possibility of reform plan that will actually move and become law. On the whole, these proposals would do little to meet those three criteria that I mentioned before, the three principles. It certainly would not produce adequacy. There are real concerns about fairness that we'll discuss in a little bit. We don't believe that they'll do a good job of promoting stability in the revenue sources so that when recessions come, we're still able to finance core public investments. So, it's really unfortunate this got cut off. So the basic, we're going to discuss several specific plans and an aspirational plan. The plan where we have a pretty good idea that the leaders in the General Assembly will go. Before we go there, they together share some features in common. That there are going to be significant cuts to the income tax, or the personal income tax, likely moving to phasing it out completely. That's that 53% of the pie chart that we were looking at before. The idea is to move to getting rid of that completely. There is a discussion of, on the way to that, adopting some kind of flat tax for the personal income tax. And then making up for some of the lost revenue by expanding the base of the sales tax. And again, we were talking before about how it's important for us to expand the base of the sales tax, but that's only going to get you so much revenue. So one of the common features of this plan is the issue of what you do with the revenue shortfall. So in some cases, we will simply lose the revenue and deeply cut spending beyond the 40-year low that we're already at. Alternately, there's a discussion to maybe increase the rate of the sales tax. We've heard as high as 8%. And that's with some funny math. We think it's closer to 10% and higher. That's just the state level. Imagine what happens when the counties have to start tacking on their sales tax. So these are some of the shared features of all the aspirational plan and the specific pieces that we'll come to in a moment. What's floating around with all of this is the idea that if we eliminate corporate income tax, which actually is bipartisan support, which should be somewhat alarming, eliminating the personal income tax, eliminating the corporate income tax will somehow spur economic growth. At the same time, though, they are talking about increasing the base of the sales tax, increasing the rate of the sales tax, which disproportionately affects low-income folks, right? Because low-income folks end up spending a larger proportion of their income on goods and services than high-income folks do, because high-income folks are able to save a lot of it. So what we find then is that a lot of the proposals are to reduce taxes for high-income folks, but actually increase them for low-income folks. So an example of that is the sales tax base that I mentioned, or the increased rate that I mentioned. Another aspect is the elimination of the earned income tax credit, which is a tax credit the state offers that matches a similar federal credit. But the idea is to put more money in the pockets of low-income folks to help cover the cost of their additional sales tax, or to cover the payroll taxes that they pay for Social Security, Medicare, those programs. And it's important to recognize that this is where we get into these issues about who has skin in the game and who doesn't. If you qualify for the earned income tax credit, you typically, or always, do not have any federal income tax liability. So what that means is you're working a low-wage job, but you're not making enough to pay taxes to the IRS, but you're certainly paying taxes to Social Security, you're certainly paying taxes to Medicare, you're certainly paying local sales taxes when you frequent your local businesses. So the earned income tax credit was created at the federal level by Ronald Reagan and Speaker Wright in the 1980s as a pro-work, anti-poverty tool. So it worked for 20 years. Bill Clinton expanded it, President Obama expanded it again. Seems to be a bipartisan consensus around keeping and expanding it. No, not in North Carolina. The General Assembly actually moved to completely repeal it, and at the same time also eliminated the inheritance tax. So the General Assembly eliminated the tax credit for working families, and at the same time passed a new tax cut for highest income folks. So again, the argument is that the argument they make is that this is important for stimulating economic growth, but it's difficult to see how repealing a tax credit that helps folks spend money at local businesses is going to help the economy. At the same time that we repealed the inheritance tax, which helped, what was it, 124 North Carolina families. Most of that money will go out of state, right, to mutual funds and the rest. And again, it's important to save. I mean, it's great to be able to save. It's great to be able to invest in mutual funds as long as they perform reasonably well, right? What they have for the last several months. But when we're talking about a tax policy, we want to make sure that low-income folks are not disproportionately affected. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, with the shared features of these plans, is that low-income folks are asked to bear that disproportionate tax load. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about specifics. Did I even move this up? Okay. Oh, one last piece on. So one last shared feature that I mentioned. We're not going to be able to see this. One last shared feature is that these plans try to lock in the revenue base for the current low level of spending. Perhaps likely reduce it even further. So what we're talking about as a starting point is locking in the current levels of investment at historic levels of disinvestment, which is a problem if we care about that large percentage of budget that was education, that was universities and community colleges. So this slide is really worthless to me. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about this.
Can I suggest take it off the slide and just show the PowerPoint? We'll be able to see the slide. It will be small, we can see it.
Okay.
There.
Yeah.
Take that column out. We'll get centered.
Yes.
All right.
Where's the
Slide. There you go.
Okay. And then I think this will help you.
That's good.
I don't know if the clicker will work then. What do I do with that one?
Just up and down.
Yeah. Very good at it.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. So I can't sort of like roam around. Okay, so from these broad commonalities, right, reduced deep tax cuts, reduced revenues, locking in lower levels of spending, likely elimination of the corporate income tax, deep cuts to the personal income tax, a shift to a consumption-based system. We have, from these commonalities, we have these 3 real plans and 1 aspirational plan. That is the stated eventual goal of at least the Senate leadership of the North Carolina State Senate. Okay, so we will start with the end goal plan and work our way backwards. This is the end goal plan. We call it the Civitas-Laffer concept. It was the report that proposes this plan was put together at the request of Senator Bob Lucho, who's the Finance Committee Chair in the Senate. Asked the Civitas Institute, which of course is supported by ARCO, and the Laffer and Moore econometrics consultant team in Washington, D.C. to put together a plan, and we analyzed it. Art Laffer was Ronald Reagan's first-term budget director who said the tax cuts pay for themselves by generating economic growth. Didn't yield that result in the 80s, so we were somewhat skeptical of his approach this time, and I think with fair reason. So the underlying sort of motivation for all of these, the underlying theory is the idea that not only do tax cuts pay for themselves, but they generate economic growth in a way that would not happen absent deep reductions in tax rates. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Okay. So here is what the Civitas-Laffer plan does. We have elimination of the personal income tax, elimination of the corporate income tax, that's that 60% of the pie chart that I pointed out before, and then the expansion of the sales tax base and the increase in the rate to as high as 8%, to really as high as There's also a business license fee. They can't tell you, it's sort of like sausage, they can't tell you what's in it, but they know it's going to yield $2 billion in revenue. And it's important, and there's also a real estate transaction fee that the realtors actively oppose. We heard that both the business license fee and the real estate transaction fee were scrapped. Both of which means that everything, all the additional revenue, has to come from expanding the sales tax. So think about that rate. That rate is now well north of 10%, folks. If we want to make sure that it's what's called revenue neutral, which is ensuring that you raise the same amount of revenue that you have under current law. Even with deep income tax cuts, you're eliminating 60% of your budget, even if you want to put 20% back, 30% back in, that's still going to require significant expansion of the sales tax base. So this is the overall concept that Senator Rucho and Senate Majority Leader Berger have supported, and we believe this is what they keep saying is their ultimate goal. They want to be able to eliminate both the personal and corporate income tax. We do think that there are some big problems with this aspirational proposal. On the fiscal side, the big one is obvious. Well, there's several big ones, but the first one is adequacy. When you eliminate 60% of your revenue base, it's very difficult to try to make that up in other ways without significant spending cuts. Both significant spending cuts and increasing the sales tax obviously hurts you on the fairness and equity side. When we're talking about fairness and equity, we're talking about the sales tax. Low-income folks already sort of feel the sales tax disproportionately harder than higher income folks do because they spend more out of their pocket just to meet daily needs. So when we're talking about this plan, we are talking about raising taxes on low-income folks. We're actually talking about raising taxes. Well, I think I can do that graph next. Yeah, I'll show you that graph in a second. But earmark that fairness piece because it gets worse, right? Low-income folks end up seeing pretty big tax increases and end up bearing a significant portion of the increased taxes there. In terms of stability, there is sort of a misnomer. That's that third principle, right? You said we want to make sure that the tax code produces enough revenue to be able to meet the needs of state government even in times of recession. And so there are concerns that the personal income tax and the corporate income tax are unstable and they vary wildly based on economic circumstances. And so the idea is shifting entirely to a consumption-based system shifts you entirely to the most stable of the three revenue streams. Now, there are a couple sort of incorrect assumptions there. The first is that somehow a one-legged stool is more stable than a three-legged stool. That just really doesn't make sense. The second is that the sales tax is somehow more stable over the long term than the personal income tax. And we don't have the slide in this deck, but we have a chart that shows that actually the personal income tax and the sales tax in North Carolina pretty much just travel together. There are, you might see one or two wilder swings with the personal income tax, but over time, in this state anyway, they've produced remarkably similar results looking over the last 30 years. Now, if you go look at the 2008 recession, 2007-2009 recession, the worst recession since the 1930s, yeah, the tax revenue is going to act a little weird, but when you start looking over the longer term, you see that really historically, the sales tax and the personal income tax, they both are reasonably stable sources of revenue for state government. And then as I alluded to, we obviously have the problem of equity. That one's good. Okay. So we have, I don't know what I did that. No, it deleted the chart, the two-page chart. That's really weird. So this is what happens, I guess, when we have, all right, I will dig up that chart and show it at the end because it's really important. When I said before that there are equity problems with this, and I said that low-income folks see a tax increase on the Civitas LAFLR aspirational plan, it's not just low-income folks. If you make less than $51,000 a year under this plan, you will see your taxes go up. That's actually a tax increase on 60% of North Carolina families. So it's hard, it can't be argued that this is some great tax cut for people. But this is what happens. If you try to eliminate you eliminate 60% of your state's revenue, shift it all to a sales tax, we all end up paying more in sales taxes than we get back with the personal income tax cut. Low-income folks, actually, if you make less than, what was it, $20,000? Chart from here. If you make less than $20,000 a year, you end up paying almost 6% more in your personal income than you did before. Where at the same time, if you make more than $1 million, the share of your income that goes to taxes will actually drop by almost. So what we're seeing actually is the greatest tax shift in North Carolina state history. We're shifting who pays the taxes from the high-end folks to the low-income folks. And we're asking the lowest income folks to bear the burden for eliminating personal income tax for those who make over $1 million a year. And I will find that chart. So it is important to recognize that this is an aspirational plan. Senator Rucho, Senator Berger have not put this into legislation, but they have said this kind of approach ultimately is where they want to go. So keep that in mind as we walk through the specifics of the three bills. And this is where I wish Alexandra, my boss right here, she's much better versed in the specifics of the legislation than I am. So I'll try to do my best and just walk through basically what's on the slide. It's important to recognize first that we don't actually have, so I said there were three different plans that have been formally introduced or were in draft form that are eventually going to lead to this aspirational plan, but this is what we have currently circulating in the legislature. So the House leadership has offered a plan, the Senate leadership has offered a plan, and then there's a Senate, what's called a bipartisan plan that's been offered by Senator Clodfelter and a number of other Democrats and Republicans. So it's important to say that the Senate leadership had, y'all probably saw it, right? Saw the news reports. They put up a website called nctaxcut.com. They put up this tax calculator and said, if you go with our plan, you'll get this kind of tax cut until people started plugging in lower income and they started seeing tax increases by logic that I was saying before. But so the Senate leadership is still apparently tinkering with the specifics of their bill. And so we don't have, at this date, we don't have anything beyond draft legislation. We're expecting for something to be formally introduced next Tuesday. That's what we hear. So we're not able to analyze the Senate leadership plan in quite the same way that we're able to analyze the House leadership plan or the Senate bipartisan plan. Okay, so what I'll try to do is just walk through what each plan does, which is be dry, but I think it's important just to put on the table. So the House leadership plan, which is House Bill 998, adopts a flat personal income tax structure, so it means everyone pays the same, 5.9% rate. The corporate income tax rate is reduced from 6.9 to 6.75, but there are no sort of loophole closes, no attempts to close tax loopholes, tax credits, sort of industry-specific credits that exist that originally the House leadership said they wanted to do. So this may end up being some changes. There are also some changes to the franchise tax, changes the way the business income tax is apportioned. The sales tax base is apportioned and the rate is cut to 6.65%. But they do that only by grabbing a few services. And it's basically just devoted, they devote the additional revenue they get from broadening the base of the sales tax to include these services to reducing overall sales tax rate. So the problem with the House leadership plan is that it basically, those changes to the personal income tax represent a $1.2 billion tax cut over 5 years, which would be the largest tax cut in North Carolina history. It's interesting because that's what the Senate claims, so they can't both be the largest in history. We'll see what actually comes of that. And so we'll, in the next slide, I'll show you, we'll see who pays. And again, it has a similar kind of fairness problem that the aspirational plan does. But so this is, the House plan is being sort of framed as a moderate approach. The governor has had his hand in it. Well, the governor has not released his own plan, I think to the surprise from a lot of us. And so it's sort of, the House plan is sort of seen as a moderate alternative, sort of the starting point for real reform. We'll also look at the Senate plan here, and then we'll talk about the bipartisan plan. So the Senate leadership plan, which again we're hoping to see next week, adopts a much deeper flat rate, down to 4.5% over 3 years. The House plan cuts it over 5 years. So the Senate has deeper cuts over a shorter period of time. And then has a similarly deep corporate income tax cut from 6.9 to 6%. They adopt single sales factor for how they apportion how firms actually pay corporate income tax. And they reduce the franchise tax in a similar way. And then they expand the sales tax to include 130 services, including groceries, prescription drugs, and out-of-pocket medical expenses. So this is something I left out of my discussion of the CFEDC plan because I wanted to talk about it here. So under the Senate plan, well, once we get the actual legislation, we'll see. According to their description of it, currently groceries, which are not taxed in the state of North Carolina, will be taxed at the county and state rate, whatever that is. So 6.5% state and whatever the locals tack onto it. So as high as 8% perhaps. So folks who buy groceries will see an increase in their sales tax from 0 to 6.5%. Prescription drugs. So obviously, well, prescription drugs are important for all of us when we're sick. Seniors in particular end up paying a disproportionate share of their income on prescription drugs. And currently those are not taxed, and under the Senate plan they would be. Even more disturbing is the out-of-pocket medical expense piece, where, as we understand it, again, we can't say for certain until we see the actual legislative language, but as we understand it, as they describe it, the out-of-pocket medical expense, the difference between what your insurer pays or Medicare pays, your share, all of a sudden is subject to 6.5% sales tax. So we all know how expensive healthcare can get, right? I mean, think about your $100,000 hip replacement surgery. All of a sudden, you're due, you could have a tax bill on that. Not on the whole figure, but on the amount that you would pay out of pocket. Let's talk about shifting taxes to people who can at least afford it, the sick, the poor, the elderly. The Senate plan, as we said, we'll see the specific language, but in its current form, there are obviously significant concerns with it. Lastly, the Senate bipartisan plan was an effort by Senator Clodfelter to, as the name suggests, really try to find a bipartisan solution to tax reform. While not as egregiously bad as the other two proposals, and certainly as bad as the aspirational plan, the Clodfelter plan also has concerns. It adopts a flat income tax rate at 6%. But there is an attempt to try to create some kind of help for low-income folks. He creates what's called a 0% bracket on the first, what is it, $11,000 in income. So that means that it's a blanket tax exemption on folks' first $11,000 of income. And the idea is, well, we're making sure that low-income folks who currently would pay taxes under the current system won't have to on their first $11,000 of income. So aspirationally, this is very positive development. The problem, though, is that there are so many folks, particularly who make less than $11,000 a year, who don't currently have any tax liability. That's why they get the earned income tax credit. Well, he eliminates the earned income tax credit too. So he has this 0% bracket that isn't necessarily, while very positive aspirationally, isn't necessarily well targeted for low-income and working folks who may not have federal tax liability, but certainly pay sales tax, certainly pay FICA taxes on Social Security and Medicare. So if anything, it's actually making it harder for low-income folks in the current system. But we do think this is a starting point for negotiation. Secondly, the Senate bipartisan plan, the Clodfelter plan, cuts the corporate income tax rate from 6.9 to 6%. I told you all that cutting corporate income tax was a bipartisan idea, and this is, we certainly see this borne out. It actually does a better job of closing corporate loopholes than the other two plans do, at least tries to. But it also adopts the single sales factor, which has some issues which we can talk about in the Q&A if you guys are interested. It also reduces the franchise tax, and it expands the base of the sales tax to services attached to tangible property, but so it doesn't affect groceries, doesn't affect prescription drugs, doesn't affect out-of-pocket medical. And it lowers the rate to 4.5%. So these are the three. I think we have the long handout. This thing. This should have a very exhaustively detailed description of each of the plans according to the sort of various metrics that we have. And that's updated as of today. We'll update it again, obviously, when the House or the Senate leadership releases its legislation next week. So, as I said, we don't have the specs yet of the Senate plan, just the broad outlines, so we can't do the analysis of the Senate plan that we're able to do with the House and the Senate bipartisan plan. So we're discussing who pays. Who is responsible for paying the lion's share of future state taxes compared to who pays them now? We still see, under each of these plans, we can measure, we still see the same kind of tax shift that we saw with the aspirational plan, it's just not as egregious. So in the House plan, this graph represents the tax change, the change in the amount of taxes that families pay as a percentage of their income under the House plan compared to current system. So we actually see a tax increase on families who earn $12,000 and below. We see a tax increase on families who make $25,000 and below. We see a tax increase in fact on everybody below 67. Everybody who earns $67,000 or less will see a tax increase in the House plan. And this is according to analysis, what's called incidence analysis that we conducted with the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy in Washington. So it's a peer-reviewed model that is used in many states to analyze it. So you can see the House plan really doesn't meet this test of fairness, right? It asks low-income folks to pay even more than high-income folks do. In fact, you can see here, if you make more than $940,000, you see your pretty big tax change compared to everybody else. And that's what happens when you eliminate a personal income tax and shift to consumption taxes. In the Senate bipartisan plan, again, it's not as egregious, but you do see an increase in taxes on the lower half of the scale. What's particularly notable, though, is that you see that the largest increase are folks who make between $41,000 and $67,000 a year. So that seems to be like classic middle-class folks, right? This plan, as our analysis shows, actually raises their taxes, which we'll see the political feasibility of this. And again, if you make more than $940,000 a year under the Clodfelter plan, you see the biggest tax cut equity. And so lastly, this question of adequacy, we don't think that any of the plans really do that great of a job of providing for the public investment needs of North Carolina. Under current law, we're able to see how revenue is set to increase at a steady line over the next 4 or 5 years. The Senate leadership plan in particular, that $1 billion tax credit over 3 years, really just keeps that at a historically low line, at about 21% of the economy. And the House plan is, as I said before, it's a little more moderate, but it still significantly reduces revenue beyond what would be provided. So, again, in this broader context of spending, we already know that we're starting out tax reform in a whole. We have historic disinvestment. We're at a 40-year low in terms of spending. We're at a 5-year low in terms of spending on education, community colleges, and higher ed. And these plans would reduce those investments even further. And we believe that that is a decision that would actually undermine the very stated purpose of tax reform, which is to promote economic growth. And so we're going to, next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of taxes in the economy. And I'll try to do it without, if you guys fall asleep. So the stated purpose of tax reform is to make sure we can cut taxes, spur economic growth, because it is argued that our tax code is uncompetitive compared to our neighbors. We do, in fact, North Carolina has the highest corporate income tax and the highest personal income tax of any of our neighboring states. And it is argued that these taxes make us economically uncompetitive. But when you look at this chart, it turns out we're not actually that uncompetitive, right? We have the lowest poverty in the region. We have in the middle of the pack in terms of median household income. We're actually doing pretty well, some of the best. We're in the middle of the pack, at least, with gross state product. That's just the size of the economy, the growth over the last 10 years. It's really only the unemployment rate where North Carolina really seems uncompetitive. And if you notice, that's always the statistic that the folks who are promoting these plans will talk about. They'll say North Carolina has a jobs crisis. We've got to cut taxes in order to get our unemployment rate down. And they're right, yes, we do have a jobs crisis in North Carolina. And I know we particularly have one in Wilmington, where the higher than the state average. The issue, though, is that tax cuts don't in fact, create the kind of economic growth that will reduce jobs in particular. So what we're talking about is how do we identify a policy that addresses job creation. We're doing okay in growth, we're doing okay in income, well, not as well as we'd like in income. But the issue here is job creation. How do we create jobs? First, it's important to know why we lost the jobs we do, why we have the unemployment rate that we do. Y'all can't really see that, can you? Okay. So what this chart shows, it would be clear if I could magnify, is that we believe that North Carolina's current unemployment rate is largely due to long-term and historic disinvestment in manufacturing. North Carolina, and this is not a story that is, I think, new to anybody, right? We all know that North Carolina had more jobs in manufacturing than, or employed a larger percentage of our workforce in manufacturing than other states did. And then we ended up, those particular industries that we were overly concentrated in compared to everybody else, ended up suffering the most from offshoring, from outsourcing, from the Great Recession, from competitive pressures across the globe. And so as a result, North Carolina was overly concentrated in some of the most vulnerable industries. So then it's no surprise then that North Carolina ended up, we had what, 16%, more than 16% of our employment base was in manufacturing. And then that base lost 41% of its jobs over the last 10 years. And that's far and away more than anyone else in the region. Certainly bigger also than the national average. So the argument that we're making here is that this is largely a function of industry-specific vulnerability, that we were, for all of the strength of manufacturing historically in textiles and tobacco and furniture, and these were jobs that provided pathways to middle-class opportunities for families across North Carolina. When those went away, because they were no longer competitive in a 21st century economy, we had a larger share of those jobs that suddenly had to be retargeted to something else. So there were workers who all of a sudden had skills that were appropriate for textiles, for furniture, and tobacco. And all of a sudden, those skills didn't work in a 21st century economy that valued other skills for other industries. So the problem that we believe that we're facing is one of industry trading for industry targeting for the 21st century. It's making sure that we can prepare the workforce for the jobs of the future. And this is not new, right? At the same time folks are promoting tax cuts, we're also hearing, oh, we need to make sure that we need to train workers. So there is this recognition that this is what's really going on, is industrial disinvestment. And in order to do that, the last thing we need to do is cut the revenue sources that fund the very programs that provide the skills for the workers that these new industries need. And that's what these tax policies do. So this is actually, can you all see this? So if we had the national average, if we had basically what the nation had in terms of a workforce, the percentage of the workforce that was involved in manufacturing in 2000, even if we lost the same number of jobs that we did over that 10-year period, we'd have 108,000 more jobs in our economy today. So if we just look like the nation in terms of how many people were doing manufacturing work, we would have a lot more jobs today than we do. And our unemployment rate, we can't do an exact, the data sources don't work to do like an exact say how what the unemployment rate would be, but we know that it would be significantly lower, and it would certainly be in line with our surrounding states, and we believe it would be in line with the national average as well. So how do we fix this job problem? Do we cut taxes? So this actually is some great research that was done that looked at all the sort of favored policies of conservative policymakers. Low taxes, right to work status, low regulatory burden, however that's measured. In fact, the research actually uses the favored indicators of ALEC, the guys in the American Legislative Exchange Council. So they have their ranking of what they think is the most appropriate to promote business growth. Well, actually, it turns out that those favored policies don't actually produce economic growth. They don't produce better economic growth, they don't produce better income growth, they don't produce better job growth. than states that pursue policies that Allan doesn't like, that involves higher taxes, more education spending, more state spending. In fact, specifically here, so we tested 50 states and found no meaningful, actually it's a negative correlation, but no meaningful relationship between better ALEC scores, so lower taxes, lower regulatory burden, and any of the economic development outcomes that we like. Which suggests that this perhaps is not, tax cuts aren't the silver bullet for dealing with industry change, industry disinvestment that are often promised. So I mentioned before how we're often compared to, North Carolina is compared unfavorably to our surrounding states because we have these higher tax burdens. Well, what's actually really interesting is that over the last 10 years, the 9 states with the highest personal and corporate income tax burdens actually performed better across all the major indicators of economic growth than the 9 lowest income tax states. And the high income states are those that are often dismissed, like California, New York, Ohio, Illinois. Turns out they actually did better than Texas, Tennessee, Florida, Wyoming, and Alaska, the states that don't have personal income taxes and overall have low tax burdens. So it turns out there's just not a lot of evidence that's there to support this idea that tax cuts, particularly deep personal income tax cuts, will somehow spur economic growth. In fact, it's actually, if you notice here, I don't have a little pointer, but the real median household income growth should be especially concerning to folks who support tax cuts. Because what we're seeing here is that the states that don't have income taxes actually saw their median household income, their wages, fall through the floor, which suggests that those states are attracting businesses that just don't want to pay their workers. They don't pay their workers enough to really keep them going with in terms of income. You see the 9 high tax states, and this includes the Great Recession, mind you, they basically tread water, which is pretty impressive given we've had massive disinvestment in middle class jobs, the jobs that pay middle class wages. So I think looking at this indicator in particular, I think we need to ask ourselves, do we want to be the kind of state that attracts industries that pay low wages? Do we want to attract the kinds of industries that pay people wages such that their income falls over 10 years, almost 4%? There hasn't been a loss like that in 70 years. What kinds of jobs do we want in North Carolina? Low wage, high wage. I don't know back. So this is the only area in which the high tax state and low tax states are comparable to job creation. So where are all the jobs that are supposed to be created by cutting taxes? They're performing exactly the same as high tax states, and they're paying lower wages. This is a pathway to poverty. This is not a pathway to prosperity. And so I think we talked about this. This is the importance of public investments. Instead of tax cuts, in order to sort of reverse the historic disinvestment in manufacturing, we need to make sure that we have public investments in the kinds of public investments that train workers to meet the demands of the 21st century. So we need to focus on quality jobs in growing industries as opposed to poorly paying jobs in declining industries. So it requires investments in education, infrastructure, targeted industry job training, technology development. Many of the public investments that have been gutted over the last 3 years. The last piece here is that in some ways promoters of low income tax policies, they have it right and they have it wrong. Their argument is that we need to put more money in people's pockets and they'll spend it. Consumers are seen as suddenly really important for stimulating economic growth. But apparently only if you make more than $51,000 a year. If you make less than $51,000 a year, then your consumption isn't quite as important, or really it takes some of that away. So it's important to recognize that consumers across all levels really matter. In fact, academic research by economists, which I'm not one, shows that low-income folks actually spend a larger portion of their income. So actually, in many ways, the low-income consumer is actually more important for local business than the high-income consumer is. Particularly given that they have to spend so much of their income on necessities. So combine that with the importance of public infrastructure, right? Schools, bridges, roads. These are the types of infrastructure that help lower business costs at the same time that wise tax policies are putting money in consumers' hands. So businesses have been able to benefit from lower costs of shipping goods to market, lower costs associated with training the workforce, lower costs associated with keeping their warehouses and factories safe. They benefit in both ways, and we see a virtuous cycle of more money being invested in business by consumers, their costs falling, so they're then able to create jobs. And it's particularly true, as we all know, in modern high school industries. You have to make sure that the workforce is adequately trained to meet the needs of high school industry. So the key takeaways. The plans that we looked at, it's not tax reform. It's not tax reform. They're tax cuts. They're tax shifts. It's shifting the tax burden from from high-income folks to low-income folks. And not asking them to go. So the middle class and poor already have skin in the game. They have more skin in the game to pay a higher percent of their income in taxes than wealthier folks do. And cutting our revenue sources will make it even harder to train the workforce, build the infrastructure, meet the public investments, and meet the needs of the 21st century industry. And lastly, tax rates don't drive economic growth. There's more research. Jared Bernstein, who used to be Vice President Biden, Chief Economist, makes the point that 9 out of the last 10 academic studies that looked at the impact of state-level tax cuts on economic growth, 9 of those 10 studies showed that there's no impact. In fact, in some cases, it's negative. So the overwhelming consensus of people who are far smarter than I says this doesn't actually work. So we would argue that it's not a good idea to try, right? That leads to further disinvestment and puts us on the pathway to poverty, not to prosperity. And we need businesses need consumers and access to markets to expand and thrive, and tax cuts do not provide that. So that is, that's it. It's 7:20, so I guess I ran over a little bit. Do you all want to do questions, or do you want to talk about how to collaborate? Any questions on the substance?
Can I just review this because there's a little...
Yes, I'm sorry.
We brought a lot of paper for you today.
We have a lot of paper.
And we produce a lot of materials. We want folks to be aware and informed about what's going on. So we brought a sampling of the kind of things that we produce, and I know some of you didn't get it, so I'll make sure that you do, and we have lots of extras here. But there are 5 things that we brought, so some of you that did get some things may not have gotten everything, and after we're done, I'll lay them out here so you can see what you don't have that you want to take with you. There's a couple different briefs, so we produce briefs on a lot of different legislation as it comes out. So you have a sample of a brief that we did on the bipartisan Senate plan that Allan spoke of. You also have a sample of a brief that we did on this issue of income taxes cuts being a core strategy for fixing the economy. And then you have a fact sheet on the House bill, the House tax reform bill that Allan spoke of. Also, this nice graphic is included. And then you also have the fast facts, which is not so fast probably when you actually get down to reading the details. But it is a good comparison of all the different legislation that's been introduced related to tax reform and kind of what it does, the basics. So I'm going to just, as you're doing the Q&A, I'm going to pass around these packets. And for those folks who got some of the handouts and want to get the others, you can come after we're done and I'll have them laid out here nice and easy.
Yeah, so to sum up, you should have everything in your hands that will allow you to see the impact, in one form or another, the impact of each of these tax plans. And you'd have the graph that got lost. No,
It was in there.
okay. That shows where historic flows in terms of spending.
And if you want to be kept informed about the type of things we produce going forward, the sign-up sheet did go around, but if you didn't sign up and you'd like to sign up to get our emails, then please feel free to do that before you leave.
If you signed up on this list by the door, we'll get that coordinated.
Perfect.
There's probably several on there.
So tell me what you guys want to do. I can do very quick Q&A, or I can very quickly run through ways that we can collaborate. I just want to be sensitive to the fact that I ran over. I apologize. Some of it is just due to technology issue. Do you want me to do Q&A first?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay. Yes.
state of Texas is actually doing, or at least the 4 urban cores of Texas are actually doing really well. Of the top 10 cities in the United States, 4 of them are in Texas. Why, I mean, why is that different than what was just said?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's two things. One I'll be like, yeah. So one is the law of averages, right? So if we look at 50 states, the Texas-style states, on average, across all of them, are not doing better. But Texas itself is supposedly, right? So what's going on there? The first is that they have this amazing oil revenue. Really, the energy sector is the fastest growing sector in the country. And so, and Texas obviously has a disproportionate share due to their oil revenue. So some of it is just, we were talking about specific industries before. I think that's a large portion of it. The second is, and they pay decent wages. And honestly, they're propping up Texas's household income in ways that if it weren't there, it would be a lot uglier than it is. And it's already pretty ugly. Texas actually has some of the lowest wages and median household income in the country. So what we know is that and they have some of the highest poverty rates. I can get specifics probably.
And the worst schools.
Yeah, right. And the highest number of uninsured as well. So that this shows is that if you're in the energy sector, if you're doing well, you're doing well. But if you're working a low-wage job, your low-wage job in Texas pays you less than your low-wage job in North Carolina. And so that's not something that I would emulate, particularly absent the oil revenue that they have, or the oil sector that they have.
But Austin really doesn't have oil. I mean, it's
Right.
a knowledge economy.
Yeah, exactly. So, but is that doesn't, I mean, that's a great point. Austin is not the model for Texas, right? I mean, it's a high-tax city. It's based on education, on high-tech, and is the most liberal city culturally in Texas. Yeah, I love the signs that say keep Austin weird, That's more like the triangle to me. I mean, economic, as somebody who looks at industry composition, that seems to look a lot more like the triangle than it does like Waco, right? I mean, Waco has a Abilene, say. What's that?
I said, or Beaumont, Texas.
Or Beaumont, exactly. Or oil in Beaumont. Yeah. Yeah. So does that answer your question? Shortly. Yeah.
I would just assert that one other thing Texas has is access to low-wage labor. You mentioned that, but that's immigrant labor.
Yeah, and actually that's a good, some of it's probably, much of it is probably low-wage immigrant labor as well.
Yeah.
Across the border. So I think in many ways Texas is an outlier in that it has things that other states don't, that aren't policy dependent. And I will also say where what they're doing is policy dependent, I wouldn't want North Carolina to look like that. Yeah.
A clarifying question. You mentioned something about groceries and no tax on groceries.
Yes.
But I know there's something,
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
see it on my
there's
receipt, so just
the state does not
clarify
levy a state level sales tax on groceries.
Okay.
The counties are allowed to, and I think municipalities are as well. I mean, so that's, when you go to the grocery store, you probably pay about, 2.5% depending on what your
there's
local.
a 7 and a 2, depending on which
Okay.
it is.
So that
Which kind
would be
of product?
local, but it's currently not.
So that's just a county. Then we have a state added on top of that.
Yes, you could, yeah, I mean, I think it's under, this is where I wish Alexander were here. Under, maybe it was the Senate plan. Maybe it was talked about, I generally don't know, I can get back to you on this, but under one of the 3 specific plans we talked about, the counties are actually capped on the amount that they can offer, the amount of tax that they can levy, which is positive from the perspective of not trying to have people have 20% sales taxes. But when you're talking about a county, particularly an urban county, wanting to be able to provide services, that creates a problem. If you're capped, if you cap a county on what they can tax, you're basically creating an artificial cap on the services they can provide.
So for that plan, you were saying there was it 6 or 7%? Was it?
I don't know which plan caps the county level. I thought.
But
it was
wasn't it, you
the
had mentioned something about a state tax though on groceries.
Yeah,
So what was?
The Senate, I'm going to give you a quick information. So certainly the Senate plan levies a tax on
So
groceries.
you basically saying there could potentially be like a 13% then? Is that? Or then it would then also cap the county, so the county would be lower?
You are always talking about attacking a local on top of the state. So the higher the state, the tougher it is, right, if you're a local county trying to tack it on as well. I wish I knew specifically which plan capped the county rate. Because yes, if you don't have a cap, then say you have a county that levies an even bigger sales tax, you could get it.
13%.
Yeah. And there are counties in Alabama where I grew up that are like that, and they're very poor, and they can't finance services. Yes.
Well, you're getting to a good point, which is, if you reduce the total revenue of the state, they have to cut something. And one of the things they're going to cut is intergovernmental transfers, which means we down here in the county and the city are not going to get as much money from the state, which means we've still got to put fire trucks on the street.
Yeah.
And we've got to put policemen in the cars. So guess what tax has to go up? Property tax. Right. It's the only one we've got, which probably explains why in Florida, where there's no income tax, the property tax is multiple of what we pay here.
And in Texas as well, to go back to that example, Texas has some of the highest sales taxes.
Very high, well, California, they got everything.
Tax.
But the burden is going to get pushed down. And when it gets pushed down, there's only one thing for the city to tax.
Yeah,
That's your house.
that's right. And the states that don't have income taxes typically have higher property tax rates.
So North Carolina seems to be always comparing itself with the other southeastern states.
Right.
Is this even a fair and valid comparison? Is the first part of my question. I mean, should North Carolina even be comparing itself to Alabama, say? And even if we do, like, is there a model in the southeast of a particular state that has adopted this low tax policy where we've been able to see the ramifications of that?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, which I think is great, is it really depends where you're sitting, right? We think that it's much better to compare North Carolina to the states we want to be like than the states we don't want to be like. And we want to be like, in terms of economic growth, in terms of skilled labor, in terms of all that, we want to be like California, we want to be like New York. You know, we have a biotech industry, a biotech sector here that's second to none, and we want that. We like that. Texas doesn't have that. Well, maybe because they have it in Austin. Tennessee doesn't have that. So one of the things that we talk about in our research is who we should compare North Carolina to. A lot of those high tax states are ones that, like Ohio, and New York, and California, are typically ones that scholarly researchers compare us to because of population and manufacturing. North Carolina is actually has the 10th largest population of any state in the country. So we are very different population-wise than Mississippi or Alabama, and so we would expect our economy to be different because of that. So that, I think that you're right on in terms of finding the right benchmarks. The reason why we make the comparisons that we do is that the legislators are concerned about our neighbors because they feel those are the folks we're competing against. They feel we're not competing against California, we're competing against Tennessee. Speaking of Tennessee, to answer your second question, yes. So Tennessee and Florida are the states that have adopted eliminating either the corporate or personal income tax and have relied on sales taxes as well. Florida is a little bit different case. It's another high population state, but they have tourism income, oil revenue that we don't, anywhere near. So Tennessee, actually, in the region, is probably the best example. In fact, it's one that Senator Rucho has repeatedly said, we can be like Tennessee. Tennessee's growing like gangbusters. They're not growing like gangbusters. Actually, North Carolina has better economic growth over the last decade than Tennessee does. So it's, Tennessee also, actually, I was just finishing up writing a piece on this today. Tennessee has higher poverty, lower median income, lower median wages across all earners than North Carolina does. Tennessee also has the highest tax, because they don't have income tax, they levy sales taxes. Their sales tax is the highest burden in the Southeast. Their low-income people pay far and away the largest share of income of any state in the Southeast. And the results are pretty clear, right? I mean, they have a lower unemployment rate. They're creating jobs. But the jobs they're creating are extremely low wage. And we're talking about a pathway of poverty. The jobs that are being created at every level pay lower wages than North Carolina's does. And so again, I am unsure of why we would want to emulate Tennessee in terms of job creation. I mean, it's great to have a lower unemployment rate, but again, a lot of that's just due to the fact that we have more vulnerable manufacturing.
I can give you an answer to that.
Okay.
Is that you're losing the big brand name economic developments for like Tennessee landed Nissan,
Yeah.
or Chattanooga landed Volkswagen, or South Carolina landed Boeing. That's what I think the politicians are saying, well, why didn't we get that? I mean, of the port cities that were recently listed, they have these big employers, South Charleston, that we compete with Charleston as a port city. Well, Charleston just got Boeing. And Mobile, Alabama recently got a car plant, or Airbus, sorry. So I think that's why we're comparing ourselves to those other states.
Yeah, and it's certainly looking at the industry composition. The automotive industry has helped prop up Tennessee's employment in ways that we don't have. But that gets to that question then of, you mentioned specific high-skill firms and extremely high-skill industries. And so is there, what I would say rather, is it clear that Tennessee is more competitive in terms of those industries? Or is it that there's something around the supply chain that's present there? Is there something around the skill mix that's there of the workers that makes it more advantageous? So I mean, I think you raised a really important point. And you can, if you want to segue into a question of incentives, but I grew up, as I said, in Alabama. And my home county won the Mercedes plant from North Carolina in 1990 with this absurd incentive package. I mean, they've been located there at least since the mid-90s, since they broke ground, and I don't think they've paid taxes yet. But that plant was transformational for Alabama's automotive supply chain. So I think that there is something deeper there, but I think it reinforces our point that there's something about the nature of our industry mix, our supply chains, how we link industries together that we need to pay attention to. But I don't think that's relevant. I don't think that it's connected to tax policy. I don't think the evidence shows that it's connected to tax policy. Yeah.
Have they done any broader base studies, specifically international, to compare larger sample pools of tax policies? Because we talk about like how North Carolina lost because I guess the proportion of how much money state taxes really are because of our federal system, it really doesn't affect government's, companies' decision all too much. Like you said, North Carolina lost jobs because we're a manufacturer. And Florida's got jobs because of another reason or another. California's got jobs. We all are basically based on the federal system, kind of all the same except for regional differences, cultural differences, and skill sets. But have they ever taken larger base studies and said, okay, this region of the world has got this overall tax policy or theology, and are they doing better than one? I mean, I know that America's held up pretty well during the global recession. What would you say about the overall tax policies of the federal government of America compared to that? And would that be a better way of gauging what micro tax policy should be in place?
I think that's a great question. North Carolina is obviously rooted in the global economy, so we need to think about global competitiveness. And I think that's at the heart of why our textile and furniture and tobacco industries had such a tough experience as they did, was because it was a lot cheaper to produce those products in Mexico and China and Malaysia than they are in North Carolina. But a lot of that was due to wages, not taxes. And that's what the research shows, is that folks, the initial rounds of disinvestment and hollowing out of American manufacturing was due to wage pressures, not to necessarily the taxes. In terms of a broader question of what does international tax policy look like, I know that there are studies. I'm not familiar enough to say, hey, such and such and such and such 2006 said this. I probably should be. That's a good question. But I think the question of federal corporate tax competitiveness and to a lesser degree state tax competitiveness on the corporate side is often tied up in this question of what the rate is, which is a little misleading, right? So from at the federal level, the federal corporate income tax rate, if you don't know, is 36%, which is the highest, and as we keep hearing over and over and over again, is the highest in the industrialized world. It's terrible, except it turns out that the average effective rate, the amount of taxes that folks actually pay after taking advantage of tax loopholes, is like 11%, which is below what most of the industrialized world levies. So we have this really complex, this is talking federally, to some degree it's mirrored at the state level, this really complex code that you have to have a team of CPAs to figure out. I think that there are legitimate concerns that the complexity adds cost to doing business, and promotes inefficiency. But at the base level of are corporations in America paying significantly higher taxes than they are in the UK, I mean, my understanding is that that's not the case. Now, Ireland doesn't levy a corporate income tax at all, so they became a corporate tax haven for offshore profits and things like that. But broadly speaking, I think that's the answer to your question. So maybe one more question, and then I know folks want to go. I want to spend 2 minutes in a second just talking about figuring out how to collaborate. Does anyone have any more substantive questions? Do you want to try to pull it out, Sandra, or should we just?
Yeah, I can.
Or should we just go with the, because it's the ways to engage piece?
Yeah.
So just go with that. Amber's our engagement and outreach person.
And I just started 2 weeks ago. So, I just moved to North Carolina 3 weeks ago from Ohio. So, but I'm glad to be here with you guys.
Yeah. So I'm really grateful that Amber's here with us. So she handles our engagement. I'd love to just spend a couple minutes talking about ways we can help each other. We would love to be a resource to y'all. We produce, as you can see, when carried away with you, vast amounts of material. Sometimes probably too vast. But if any of you have any specific questions about this issue or about other state issues related to state fiscal and economic policy, please do not hesitate to contact us. We'd love to be able to provide you resources. I do a lot of writing on economic development, particularly on incentives, which I know is a hot topic here in Wilmington. That's something else we can talk about in the future. We'd be happy to be a resource. We would be happy to be a resource collectively. Because I know that we are, from what Lloyd has said and from what I understand, we have very similar views of where North Carolina to go in terms of creating quality of life for its residents. And so we want to support y'all as you do that work. If you're interested in the work that we do, there are a number of different ways you can plug in. We are an advocacy organization. We don't just do research and let it sit. We try to have a point and impact. And the more ways in which we can get that out to folks and have y'all echo that message, the better that I think we're all going to be. So ways to engage, obviously, we love, Lloyd was actually kind enough to write a piece with us and for us earlier on tax reform. Opinion pieces, letters to the editor, if you guys are interested in that. I'm sure many of you already do that. If we can help supply you with additional information that you would find helpful, we would love to do that. One of the ideas that we've been kicking around is doing a newspaper ad in the Star News, where I know many of y'all are actively involved in the community. If you'd like to lend your name to that, we will. I mean, we're gonna pay to put in probably a full page or half page ad. But if y'all want to express your support, we'd be interested in that. And then, obviously ways that we can work together in one-on-one conversations with, folks that y'all know. Share your views, share your interests, and then with your local elected officials. We have to hope that at the end of the day, elected officials will be responsive to the needs of their constituents, the expressed desires of their constituents. And so we'd love to just help you all with that where possible. So do you have any questions about this or ideas or what? I know it's late.
I'll add a couple of things.
Yes, please.
So one thing that we've started, which I just kind of thought some of you might be interested in, is something called a letter to the editor core, where we're getting out specific information to folks around the state about what we'd like to target letters to the editor around to local papers around. So specifically, we started out, we sent it to the core, we said, hey, we really want letters to go out in response to the Senate tax proposal. And then it was the sort of taxes and economic growth issue was the next week. And then the third week, which was last week, was the Senate budget. And then we give folks in these emails fact sheets and templates and a link to a website that has kind of tips about letters to the editor writing. So if you'd like to be involved in something more specific like that, I have all of your contact information, and what I can do is just kind of follow up with an email and let you respond if you'd like to kind of be included in that as well. And if you do sign up on our sheet, or sounds like I get the sign-in sheet, so I get all of you if you want it or not. Then we do send out action alerts, and that kind of lets you know when you can respond specifically to your local elected official or to your state legislators about specific issues. You know, what's the particular issue, when's the best time, and it connects you directly to their contact information. So there's lots of ways to get engaged, and we're kind of continuing to explore that as we go along.
Yeah, and so the last thing I would say is that this is we view this as a really exciting beginning to a conversation with y'all. Y'all are actually the ones in the community doing the work, and we'd love to collaborate. So I guess we can, you know, I'll stay in touch with Lloyd. If you guys, please contact me. I think our materials have our info. My email address. Yeah, I mean, it's all on the slides. I'll make sure you guys get the slides.
I'll leave a stack of my business cards.
Yeah,
If we can,
anyway, we would love to, love to be able to collaborate with y'all. So please, if you have ideas, just let us know. So thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.